Thank you so much. Now, Dr. Harris has kindly agreed to answer some questions now. So we have 2 roving microphones. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and wait for one of the microphones to come to you. And I might also ask that you keep your questions short and to the point.
Thank you very much for your talk. You spent a fair amount of time unpacking and trying to define what miracles are. I was curious, do you have anything to say specifically about perhaps what science is? Because that could potentially bear several interpretations.
What science is? Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I took science as read. Partly, I think that was probably because I knew I was speaking in the physics department. No, you're right. I didn't define science carefully. I'm glad you asked that, actually. It's one of the things I've been working on recently. I sort of started getting into the philosophy of science and realised just how complicated that is, actually. I didn't even hint at this, but there is a big debate I'm learning all about what exactly is a law of nature in scientific and philosophical terms. Is a law of nature prescriptive of nature? Does it prescribe what nature has to do, or does it describe what nature does? So there's a big debate going on all about the foundations of what laws of nature are. And you're absolutely right, I didn't say very much on that, except to say that, I'm sorry, but actually, if I brought all that in, it would become even more complex. So even more yeses and nos.
Thank you. On a number of occasions, you said something to the effect that the question whether the miracles of Jesus contradict science is beside the point, or not the primary question, or not determinative of answering the question whether you should believe that they occurred, and that sort of thing. But I wonder if you might make a little more clear, okay, so it's not the primary question, but do you think that belief in the ministry of Jesus entails that there has been outside direct intervention interrupting the normal flow of atoms and swerves, so to speak, in a way that would not have occurred had Jesus not been divine in some way?
Certainly, thank you. I mean, you're asking the question I ended with, really. Do I believe in the miracles of Jesus? My answer to that would be yes, I do. That does go beyond what I was trying to say, though, which was essentially how do you establish what a miracle is, given the type of evidence we have and the nature of science. So I was essentially trying to put forward the sort of complexity of that issue and how actually the question of how a miracle relates to science is that once you begin to examine things, it's rather secondary to a degree. But if you ask me, do I actually believe that some kind of supernatural power was demonstrated in these miracles, then I would say, as a Christian believer, yes. And I also think that it's a significant part of the tradition that Christians have inherited to grapple with that. Many Christians don't believe in the miracles of Jesus, interestingly, but retain and live in faith in Jesus. It's something I think that all Christians are called to grapple with continually. There are no easy answers with miracles. I hope that has become clear from what I said. Grappling is the key.
Dr. Harris, I'm a parish minister, and one of my members gets very excited around this time of year because she's got a bush in the garden that when the leaves come onto it, she's convinced bears a remarkable resemblance to the face of Jesus. So that could be another slide to add to your collection. But I wanted to refer to your quotes from David Hume. I never thought I'd find myself in agreement with the learned gentleman, but I think that negative argument concerning the miracles perhaps might be interesting to apply to the resurrection, because the transformation that apparent event has in the followers of Jesus, I think is so remarkable as to almost render it less likely that something of that order of significance didn't happen. I'm wondering whether the key to understanding the miracles of Jesus lies in the way that John in his Gospel presents them as signs. Because it would appear that Jesus himself is quite a reluctant wonder worker, that comes through quite strongly in the temptation in the wilderness. And therefore it suggests to me anyway that the Gospels are as restrained as they possibly can be in terms of feeding us just enough to be going on in order to recognize Jesus for who he is. Which means that when it comes to reconciling miracles and science, science being an evolving discipline, as it were, it becomes a useful tool, or potentially useful tool, in understanding the miracles and their significance. And that relationship we might expect to continue to develop as science develops.
Thank you. Yes, that's right. So surface level conversations about the relation between miracle and science often assumes that science is a fixed point and we all understand what science means. As the first person asked me that is actually not quite the case. Science is always moving, often struggling to catch up with it, and in many degrees, in many ways, we actually don't know what science tells us about fundamental questions about where the laws of nature come from that we're comparing miracles with. Thank you for raising that point about the existence of the church. That is often cited as one of the main pieces of evidence, if not the only piece of evidence, for the resurrection of Jesus. The fact that so many people became motivated very early on to completely give up their lives, in many ways, their previous livelihoods, and go out and, at great risk to health and life, tell this amazing story, which to many people seems like nonsense. So, yes, the fact that people were willing to do that and form this vast, very quickly growing body is for many taken as being a strong argument in favour of the resurrection. Something must have happened to convince people. On the other hand, the skeptics would say, well, this is human psychology. We need to understand better about what motivates religious faith. And you get into very complicated arguments about to what degree is religion actually, religious belief, a natural part of human existence. We want to have belief, many of us. So thank you for mentioning that. And what was the question that really arose from your... That's right.
It was whether you believe that the real question isn't so much whether science contradicts miracles or vice versa, but whether we should be taking the miracles at face value and applying science as a better or less useful tool in order to understand what the miracles tell us about Jesus.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I understand what you're saying. So effectively, could science be a method, like a filter, or a way of looking at miracles such that you can understand, does this story break the laws of nature or not? Yes or no? Therefore, we can categorize it into one type of miracle or another. But I think clearly in the Gospels, as I was saying, but as well as that question of whether it really happened and the questions we're so fascinated with, how does this compare with science, there are much deeper level currents going on too. And in order to understand the whole complex of any one of these stories, you have to look at the rest of them and see the significance. And as I suggested with the theme of the 5,000, it's a particularly rich miracle. In order to appreciate, well, did this really happen or not, you also need to take that alongside all sorts of other questions, like what exactly is this telling us on all sorts of symbolic levels. So what I'm trying to say is the miracles are very, very rich. I hope that answers your question.
As a doctor, I've always found the resurrection rather difficult in terms of the body actually going up. And I like the way you explained the different points of view and how you can understand that in different ways. But the one you didn't explain, which I also find very difficult, is the virgin birth. I find that really difficult to believe in, and I wonder what different views in the same way there are of that.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering when someone would ask me about the virgin birth. In many ways, it's the hardest of all miracle stories in the Bible, because for one thing, it's only told in two of the Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Mark and John, do they know of it? Well, this has been debated endlessly. Not obviously anyway. So it's not significant to them, and neither is it significant to Paul, the other big author in the New Testament. So, at least in terms of the sources we have, the virgin birth does not appear to be hugely significant. Added to which, there are various ethical questions that have been raised about the virgin birth. If it's true that the Son of God needed to be born by this amazing way without a human father, then what does that say about the rest of us who are born the normal way? Questions about the purity of the Virgin Mary. The Church has often made an awful lot of the virginity of Mary, even going so far as declaring her a perpetual virgin, for instance. Flies in the face of quite a lot of what the New Testament suggests when we hear about Jesus' brothers, for instance. In any case, there's a whole kind of nest of issues around the virgin birth. But at the end of the day, not very much rests on it in terms of the Christians are, the most important issue is salvation. And of course there, in the narrative, the focus is on the cross and the resurrection. So the issue about the virginity of Mary is actually of only secondary importance doctrinally, although I know a lot of churches do get very hung up on it. There have been endless debates over the last 2,000 years over it. I hesitate to say I'm an agnostic about the virgin birth, but I don't know what to make of it, and I've been thinking about it for a very long time. This is one of those ones I think you just have to keep grappling with. It's in the tradition, we have to face it, but I don't know what to do with it. And that's my honest answer.
Bishop Jenkins, that's a good answer.
My question has been slightly overtaken by events, but can I make a comment in saying I'm very happy to see that this series of lectures is called Science and Religion, at least that was my email said, rather than Science and Christianity, which I think is too prescriptive, and the other religions, the other great religions of the world, have a lot to offer to this sort of argument. Anything that seems supernatural could be argued as scientific. And the advance of science at the moment is so fast that there are a lot of things that we don't really understand, and therefore shouldn't be too surprised by some of the things we've discussed. For instance, we understand at the moment, or science understands at the moment, matter, fluid, and gas. But it's pretty well known that there are other planes of goings-on above those planes.
What kind of goings-on are you thinking of? Like dark matter and dark energy, for instance?
Well, yes, that is one of the modern science, black holes and things like that. But there is helium. How does it happen? There are lots of obvious pointers to the fact that we haven't understood all the planes on which we function. Could you comment on that?
I think, quite apart from the question of religious significance of the things you mentioned, science is very much an open book, I think, that is still perpetually evolving. And I think the day that scientists start to think we really do understand the universe will be the day science has probably taken the wrong turning. There is far more we don't understand than we do, I would say. So even from that point alone, as a scientist, I would say, there is a huge amount of mystery and wonder in the world which we need to understand in order to just move on to the next step. We're fairly confident now, I would guess, that we have continually been moving forward. We will slowly get further forward, but the question is, well, where is science going? I'll just use a metaphor forward there. As though there's a progress. Is science progressive? Good question, that one. To do with the philosophy of science, which I won't go into. But then when you start to take the religious aspects of it, clearly, the waters get very muddy, because once you emphasize the open-endedness of science, the lack of determinism and so on, combine that with religious positive outlooks, and I think there's huge amounts of fertile territory here, which is why I'm convinced that the science-religion dialogue is one of the most important ones going on in modern culture today. It's not just a little isolated niche subject within theology. This is one of the most important dialogues that human beings can be involved in.
Thank you.
Could I start with just a straightforward question, but then explain a little bit what I mean by it? If we went back to the quotation from Schleiermacher, could his comment be understood not as to do with subjectivism, but to do with categories? That's the question. The reason for asking it is that Hume quite clearly was operating in a very sort of Platonic universe, sort of double-decker universe, and we are still much more influenced by Platonism than we maybe realise. Jesus clearly was not a Platonist, but rather operated in a universe where heaven and earth were interpenetrating rather than vastly separated, and there were occasional forays from heaven to earth. Paul then takes that further when he talks in Colossians about the whole of creation being held together in Christ, and that clearly belongs to that Hebraic world and certainly not the Platonic world. The Hebraic world, as well as statement of faith here, seeming to be much truer, might also be understood as much more complex and sophisticated and much more closely related to some of the things that have been found in this very fluid scientific universe that we are now coming into understand, as you talked about, and which indeed the gentleman just before me also referred to. How important are categories when we come to understanding miracles?
Thank you. So, by categories, do you mean like the philosophical categories you mentioned, Platonic, Semitic, cosmologies?
Yes, cosmologies are understanding of the universe. How far can we be helped in our understanding of the universe if we see heaven and earth as being interlacing rather than bi-level separate?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. That's a really interesting question. I didn't mention cosmologies, partly because that will be another 10 minutes or so, but also because you're right, that cosmology is at the centre of a lot of the way we view science and religion. Hume being a Platonist, I wasn't quite sure what you meant about that. I mean, in terms of the physical universe, of course, Hume would be Copernican. Were you suggesting that, in the sense of the Platonic universe, is sort of multi-layered, very complex, with just ascending hierarchies? Is that
No, I think I was out of my depth a little bit.
Oh, okay, sorry.
You say Copernican by all means.
Okay, sure, yeah. So scholars often say that the Semitic cosmology was three-tiered: underworld, earth, heaven. Now, I don't believe that to be the case, actually. If you want to know why, read my book. But nevertheless, it was clearly a very different kind of cosmology to the Copernican one. So you asked about to what degree might our cosmology suggest that heaven and earth interpenetrate each other. One of the ways I would like to explain that, or not, perhaps not explain it, but explore it, is to suggest that one of the interesting things that's arisen in the science-religion dialogue is to try to understand how, given that chance and complexity are known to be so important to scientific understandings of the world, evolution, for instance, how can we understand these theologically? Because Christians have for centuries thought of God as being a grand designer to some degree, putting humans on the earth with purpose. Evolution would therefore have to be progressive. Now, science flies in the face of that to quite a large degree, emphasizing chance and complexity and so on. How could we possibly integrate or understand the scientific emphasis on chance against the theological view of that there is a divine purpose behind all of this? One of the ways in which scientists, theologians have explored this is to see God much less in terms of God who is outside everything, a miracle. You notice I didn't use this word intervention, divine intervention. I've got a terrible kind of fear. I really don't like this term, divine intervention, miracle. It suggests that nature is a closed system. God has to kind of break in order to do things. So one of the issues that has arisen from trying to understand chance, complexity, evolution in theological terms is to suggest that God works in all of the novel, chance, complex processes of the world through the person of the Holy Spirit. And so Trinitarian theology has been built up from this idea. God is not the distant God who is outside of everything, he needs to break in. God is also, the technical term is immanent. God is transcendent, God is other, God is also right here with us. And that's one of the things that's been sort of emphasised recently in the science-religion dialogue, trying to understand how God might be said to exist alongside chance and chaos.
Hello. I wanted to bring in the area of compassion. Behind many of the more human so-called miracles in the gospel stories, there are healings, there are people in grief, there are people needing that human connection. And for them, it's an individual experience of transformation that is more of a miracle. And behind almost all these miracle stories, as I've read, is an element of compassion. Why did Jesus feed the 5,000? Why did he bring up food? It wasn't to show something miraculous. It was because he cared about them, behind all of that. And I just wanted to bring that into the discussion a bit, the element of behind why these things might have happened. Rather than a question, I guess, it's throwing another angle.
No, thank you. That's a very useful comment to make. That's for sure. Emphasising, concentrating on whether miracles break science or not, does tend to rather ignore the fact that these are, so many of them are wonderful human stories, full of interest and compassion and agonies that are suddenly wiped clean, solved by Jesus. So they are amazingly human stories, and that's another way in which concentrating on whether they contradict science or not actually rather misses the point a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It seems to me that you haven't been very decisive in your answers to the question, because it can only be two answers, yes or no. Either the miracles happened as you've been described, in which case they don't obey the laws of nature and science, or Jesus was some kind of conjurer who could do things because he saw it coming and do it at the right time and so on. So I think I think the question is more, do you believe them or don't you believe them? And you said you do. And then the question is, how do you decide whether to believe them or not? And just if you don't mind, I'll be personal for a moment. I'm fortunate in that I had a daughter who was extremely ill. Doctors could do nothing. We bathed her in holy well and she got completely better. I say that's a miracle. You may say it's something completely different, but it makes it very easy then for me to believe in miracles.
No, thank you. Thank you for the story there. No, I maintain that my answer is still yes and no. It's not yes or no. It's definitely yes and no. The reason being that, as I suggested, there is a subjective element to defining what a miracle is about in the first place, so there's already a degree of yes and no there. But more importantly, the miracles of Jesus as a category are actually so diverse that while some of them may be seen to contradict science, others don't. So that's a straightforward reason why I think you have to say yes and no at the same time.
But surely the ones that don't aren't really miracles.
They were clearly told to be understood as miracles in the sense that they point to the deeper significance of who Jesus is and relationship with God.
I have a question. It comes back to the question of clarifying what you mean by science. I have the same question. And I'd also like to ask if you could clarify what you mean by miracle. You said, and I'm not sure I got all your words right, but thank you for your talk, by the way. Thank you. That a miracle is a recorded event, and it is claimed within it is performed by divine power. Make sure I got that all right.
Shall I go back to...
Sure, yeah.
There.
Okay, yeah. And I think what I noticed about that, and I'm pondering this, that your definition of miracle comes from the standpoint of the one who is seeing it as an interpreter, rather than from the standpoint of an event that simply happens in time and space. And so what I'm wondering is then what you would do with stories like an exorcism, say in Mark chapter 3, and there is a parallel account in Matthew chapter 12 that actually reports an exorcism that has different interpretations. So some would say that the exorcism is accounted for by a divine power, but others would interpret it as Jesus being crazy, and that's what his family would say. And the religious leaders would say that he's possessed by Beelzebul. And so if something happened, Jesus cast out demons, but not everybody is saying that it is attributed to a divine power. So that seems to point to something happening in time and space, but it wouldn't go with your definition. And the other, I guess, healing that I would point to is in John chapter 9, which is the man born blind, where Jesus heals the man born blind, and some would call that attributed to divine power. His parents would say, I don't know what happened. And then he goes to the temple and he says, well, Jesus did it. But and then the Pharisees would say, well, this man was blind and he's not, and Jesus, he can't be divine. So a miracle happens. Well, okay, I won't call it a miracle. Something happened in time and space. The man was blind, and now he's not. And there are different interpretations. So that also doesn't quite seem to, there's an event that happened in time and space, but it's not from the standpoint of the interpreter. It's from the standpoint of the event. Does that make sense?
I think so, yes, there's quite a lot in that. So a story, we have text which tells a story where the observers claim to have seen something in their time and their space.
Yeah.
Is that the same as our time and space? Well, this is a question of narrative interpretation and so on. But I think the question maybe
Well, the question I'm asking is, your definition of miracle is that it's something that is reported as an event that is divine, something divinely happening. And so the definition of miracle seems to be from the standpoint of the interpreter, which seems to be that it is, maybe a biased report of something that happened.
No, sure.
Rather than something happened in time and space, and how are we seeing this?
I never claimed that this was watertight.
So I guess I'm just wondering how you respond to stories like that seem to not to be that way.
Sure. Well, we always read the stories in second or more hand, don't we? From one, so they're always reported events. If I were there, well, it's a different question. A parallel way of looking at this is the old question of, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Okay. If a miracle happens and no one is there to witness it, is it a miracle? I think the answer is quite clearly not. There has to be an observer. There also has to be someone to pass on the story. And what I was trying to say in that definition was that a miracle, a claim of a miracle, always invites and demands further investigation and assessment and interpretation. It doesn't just stand alone as an event in time and space, and simply can't. That's the point of what I was trying to suggest, really, in that I admit flawed definition. The one above it, I think, is the only watertight definition I will stand by. Does that answer that part of your question?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Can you please join me in showing our appreciation?